In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to apply auto layout and constraints to improve your design's responsiveness. This is the second video of my Figma series on the Google homepage. If you are new to Figma, then you may want to check out my previous video, which includes a review of all the fundamentals and basics that you need to know about Figma before getting to this point. If you are new to my channel and you want to see how far I'm going to be taking this design in the upcoming videos, then make sure to hit the subscribe button because you're going to get that and a whole lot more. I would appreciate it a lot. So let's dive right into it. This is the same file that I left you with last time. You see now it includes a start and end for the basics that we did in the previous video. In this video, we're going to be covering responsiveness and auto layout. And as you can see, we have a start and end for this as well. And the start for this section is actually the end, of course, of the previous video, which includes this design that we did that included as, if you were watching that video, you know, it includes a top navigation on the top. It includes a center area with the Google logo, the search box, 2 buttons, and a little text to switch languages. And in the bottom, it includes a footer area with 2 rows. If I were to move this around on the right side, and I would do that by putting my mouse over the edge here and just going a little bit like that, you can see this does not respond well to responsiveness. It does not respond well to the change in width. And if you were to go to the actual Google homepage and you were to try that out, you would see that the behavior is actually a little different. So there's a couple things that are happening here. First of all, the top nav is resizing the 2 sides as I'm moving this. Also, the center area is staying centered up to a certain point, and even when I get down all the way here, the search bar itself is changing its width. And then you can see also a little bit of an animation here in the footer as I am going from this point to that point. And in this video, we're going to be talking just a little bit about breakpoints, what they are, how to capture them, and then how to design accordingly to provide a breakpoint compatible responsiveness. So going back to the start page here and responsiveness and auto layout, this is where we're going to be starting off today, and we want to get all the way to this end page here that, as you can see, includes a couple of frames for the different breakpoints. So breaking this into 3 parts again, as last time, let's start talking about this top navigation here. And as we're going to go through these, we're also going to be improving our layer structure, because this is going to introduce very important improvements and how we are sorting out our Figma file so that when we're making changes in the future, things are a lot more doable and faster. So we're going to do a bit of that as well. So if you'll recall, we have here our About and Store. Now, this is the first place where we may want to introduce a little bit of organization. I'm going to multi-select these 2. And if you want to introduce an auto layout, you can just hover over here to the plus where it says auto layout with these 2 selected, or I can use my keyboard shortcut Shift A. Now, when I do that, you will see that says auto layout added. These 2 layers here just became part of a parent called frame 4, and I can change this to left nav links. Now, if you've got a little bit of a coding experience, auto layout is essentially flex from CSS. It allows you to define the relationship in terms of spacing and positioning between different layers of your design. And so the relationship that we've defined for these 2 particular items is I want to have a 16 pixel spacing between the items. So if I were to, for example, grab this layer and I want to duplicate it, so I can do Command C, Command V, let's say. I can do this and that, and you will see that as I add that layer, automatically the next one that is going to be placed inside this container maintains that relationship ongoingly. And there's a couple things you can check out here, but we're going to essentially explore them hands-on throughout this design. But you could say you got some auto layout properties if you have the parent container selected. And you can see, for example, you can change the direction of the auto layout. So is it a horizontal auto layout or is it a vertical auto layout? So you can see that here, the same 16 pixel spacing is preserved following that vertical axis. So you can change that. You can change, for example, what spacing you want to be in between the items. Instead of 16, it could be, for example, 40. Now you see that it applies that accordingly. And then here you've got some more properties that are attributed to padding. And padding has to do with the spacing around the layers, around the objects that you are dealing with. So if I were to add here an 8, you can see that now the parent layer is a little bit bigger because now it's not just the layers, it's also a little bit of spacing that the layer has to respect. You can go a little bit more in depth about auto layout by clicking on this icon here if you don't want to have 8 pixel across all the different sides. So you've got top, bottom, left, and right. And in this case, we've applied A to all of the sides. I could change this to say, for example, 4 and 4. And I can change the way that this spacing is applied, the way the auto layout works. I can modify the relationship of the inner elements through this grid over here. So we're gonna be able to do a little bit of hands-on across different points of the design where we're gonna be applying these concepts. So don't worry about these too much right now. For the sake of this area here, we're good to go. All we wanted to do is set up that relationship. So we've got 16 pixels. If ever in the future, Google is gonna introduce a link here, all you gotta do is do this, and then that consistency will be preserved. Now that we talked about that, let's go to our right side. And you see here there is 2 links as well. We've got our grid and we've got our user profile. So same thing here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 2. I'm going to do my keyboard shortcut, Shift A, frame 4. We're going to change this to right nav links. There we go. And I'm going to introduce also a constraint, not just auto layout, but the positioning of the element with respect to its parent container, in this case, the screen. So you can see here that the constraint is set to left and top. We want this to actually be constrained around the top and the right side of the screen. So as I am resizing later on, it's going to get sticky to those sides. So I'm going to change this just by clicking on this one over here. And now it should be constrained to the right side of the screen. Now we're going to do the same thing here. I'm going to grab this one. This one we already constrained top and right. This one as well. Perfect. And you may wonder why I used auto layout here and not across all the elements. That is because we do not actually have a consistent spacing between the elements. Between these 2, we have 16. Between this and that, we got 20. And then we have 16 again. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to unify these 2. I'm going to call this area user. And you see here what it did. It automatically aligned everything inside the container to the top left. And that relationship is dictated by that icon that I showed you earlier here in auto layout. It's regarding the alignment and the padding. So with regards to the alignment, you have to think about, okay, how do I want the positioning of these elements to be placed within the layer? And in this case, you just want to make sure that things are centered horizontally. So if anything, it would be something like this, and boom, we've got our expected positioning there. Awesome. Now that we only have one spacing in between, we can actually auto layout these if we want to. You could just frame it as well if you want, since auto layout is also most helpful if you are planning to expand that layer through added elements. In this case, we don't have much of that going on, but we're going to do it anyway. So I'm just going to do my Shift A and C did the same thing. So I have to go here. I have to align it horizontally. And now we've got the result that we expected. Now, in terms of the constraint of this, we have to go back up here to constraints and resizing and make sure this is set to top right. So as we are changing the screen width, it's going to adapt accordingly. So that looks pretty good. If I were to add a new text here, you see it is added to the left, and that is due to the way that we've defined these constraints and auto layout. So we are almost good to go. Now let's just double check that our layer management here looks pretty good. So I'm going to call this top nav right area, just to be clear. And I'm going to grab these two, and I'm going to do a shortcut for framing. And that shortcut is on Mac, it's Command-Alt-G. And now you see it creates a frame for, so I'm going to call this top nav. And I'm going to change the constraints, in this case, to left and right. Because in this case, the screen can be moved either through the left or through the right. And now if I resize this screen, you should see that this works beautifully. Next area we want to cover is that center area with the logo and the search and the button. So let's get right to it. I personally like to do the constraining of all the elements even before I group them. It just helps keep the layers organized, even though the constraint that matters in the end is that of the outermost layer with respect to the screen, but I personally like to do this anyway. So I'm going to just set this logo up to center. I'm going to set this one up to center. And by center, in this case, it means that as I'm going to resize my screen, it's going to stay centered with the same width property, moving around as I am resizing. So that's the intended behavior that we want here. And if you're ever wondering what the intended behavior is, you can always think about, okay, what is the expected result that I want to get to? And you can see here that it's just being continuously placed in the center as I move this around. So going back to Figma, now here's a good placement here to do some auto layout for the buttons. So I'm going to auto layout this, and then I'm going to keep this centered. This is applying a 12 spacing in between. We don't have to think much about the alignment here, but I'm just going to keep it center. So in the future, if I may want to add a third button, it's going to preserve that nice alignment with respect to the screen. But in this case, it doesn't seem like Google's going to do that anytime soon, nor are we. So let's just keep it as it is, and that's going to be fine. We're going to call these buttons. Now, this is logo, this is search. Let's change this maybe to search box, so it's a bit more explanatory of what we've got going on. And we can keep this just as it is. Now, we have to look at the spacing between elements to try to understand how we're going to group these together. So here we have a 24 pixel difference, here we have a 32, and here we have a 56. So it does not seem like a very good candidate to do any kind of auto layout here, because actually our spacing is not that consistent in any way. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to multi-select these, and I'm going to do Command-Alt-G, remember, for that shortcut. This is a very, very useful shortcut. You're going to be framing things a lot on Figma. So Command-Alt-G, that's how you make some frames really fast. So I'm going to change this to center area. And now, as I mentioned, even if we apply constraints to the inner elements of this layer, the outermost constraint is what matters with respect to the next parent layer. So if I resize this, you will notice that this is not actually moving, even though we made those constraint changes earlier. So what we want to actually do is make sure that this one that we just created is also respecting that center constraint. So now if I move this, voila, looking good. We have one more area to cover, that is the bottom section footer with the 2 rows. And there's a couple things we can do here. So I'm just gonna change this frame 2 to row. We're gonna call this footer row 1. And I realized that actually from my last video, I did not put the text layer inside that row. So we're going to do that right now just by dragging it in. So just drag it from the left side and into your upper layer here. So now the text is inside the row number 1. So that looks good. And now want to make sure that this, with respect to the footer, it's just left center. So that looks pretty good. And now what we can do is we can take the links and we can apply auto layout here. We're going to call this nav links left. And we're going to come here and we're going to call these nav links right. And in this case, same as we did in the top, we want to apply constraint on the right, and in this case also with respect to the center. Center one is not so important, but if you want to be pixel perfect, in this case, we can go ahead with that. And now what we can do is I can multi-select all of these and just individually have them be a left and right constraint. So we would theoretically already have our result. Looking good, right? I'm going to call this, by the way, footer row 2. And we're going to call these what they are, dividers. Okay, so just for the sake of cleanliness, because we have these two nicely organized, I'm going to also group these, and we can actually auto layout these, and this will actually come handy for later. So I'm going to auto layout them, and I'm going to call it footer. And now I'm going to make sure that this is actually left and right, and we cannot do that yet because we have to double check that the inner layers of this auto layout are following a certain pattern here of fill container. So width set to fixed for footer. And now I think I can actually do my left and right. There we go. Because these were not following that fill container and they had a fixed width, the outer layer could not give me the option of setting that left and right. So we had to go inside and sort that out. And now the last thing I could do here is set this to a bottom constraint. So if I were to resize the top area, sorry, not the top area, if I were to resize from the bottom area of the screen, it would also give me a nice resizing, repositioning here of the footer. Now, if you go to the actual Google homepage, there's a little bit more of a fanciness going on. At a certain point, the logo is also doing some funny animation. We're not going to get into that level of detail in this video, but we can tackle it later on through animation. For the sake of where we are right now, this is looking pretty good. Now, the second part of this whole process is the breakpoints. A breakpoint is essentially a point in the width of the screen where the design patterns that you previously had don't behave very well with the new adjustment in the width. If we go to the Google homepage, we can see that as we resize the screen, there's a certain point in the width that the footer items are being placed one on top of the other for that second row. So that's what we're going to do right now. And then there's a second breakpoint, which is actually here. As you can see, the search box itself is also adjusting based on that responsiveness. So it's actually changing the width of the search box as you go to the sides, and it's keeping a width that is with respect to those two. So we're going to actually cover those two breakpoints in our Figma design. Now, Figma at this point in time does not have a native support for breakpoint design. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 additional frames for 2 different screens where we account for the change in breakpoint. So when we would theoretically hand this over to the engineers, they would be able to tell, okay, the designer wants certain repositioning and alignment of the elements when the design reaches this pixel value of width adjustment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste this whole screen. So now we have Google and Google side by side. And what I'm going to do is, and I've checked this out before, so we can save the maths. But essentially, you can go back to that google.com and see where exactly that breakpoint is taking place. And in this case, we have 808 and 648. So I'm just going to change this to Google 808 BP, so it's clear what the value of that breakpoint is. And I'm going to change the width of this screen to 808. So this means that once the design reaches this point, going further, narrower with the screen, I want a repositioning of the elements. And in this case, what we are seeing here is that what used to be the left nav links now are placed underneath, and the right nav links are placed right on top. So that's what we're going to do right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the height of this 2x. So as you can see, actually, how we define these constraints, it's making these move a little bit more up or down. So just for the sake of having this be the same, I'm going to put them like that. And now I can change this exactly to 80. And here's why I mentioned earlier that it would be helpful to set an auto layout for that footer area, because as you can see, as we are increasing the height of footer row 2, everything else that sits above within that auto layout is moving responsively. And that is incredibly helpful because we can resize the footer row without having to do any edits on the other 2 layers, or in this case 3, the 2 dividers and footer row 1. So now that we've got the spacing figured out, we want to change the repositioning of these 2. So nav links left is now going to be centered, and I'm going to use my tools here on the top of the design sidebar here, and I'm going to align horizontal centers, and I'm going to place this 12 pixels from the bottom of the screen. And now this one is also going to be centered, so I'm going to center that out, and I'm going to also use the tool to place in between. So now we've got what we wanted. Let's double check this is the end result that we were looking for. Now I'm pretty sure we may want to even consider, let's see how Google handles that. Okay, no, Google actually keeps the spacing here to be double with respect to that. So we're going to keep it at 24. That's fine. And then we could also do just a little bit of consistency here and keep this also centered. Why not? So I'm just going to change this to top, and I'm going to change it to center, and that should give us the expected result that we were looking for. So now if I resize this, you can see that everything stays in place. Neat. So the last breakpoint we have to cover in this video is the point where our search box has to resize based on the width. And that breakpoint, as we discussed earlier, is 648 BP. So as I did earlier, I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to change the title just to be super clear, 648 BP. There we go. And I'm going to change the width of the screen to 648. Now, if we're looking at this piece over here, we already got that outermost layer here. And what we want to do essentially is as we go lower, that outermost layer is going to shrink. And with that shrink, we're going to also shrink the search box that is contained inside. So the way to do that is change the constraint here from center to left and right. So now, even though you see that nothing is changing, actually the outermost layer is doing the work. The problem is that we've defined the outermost layer constraint, but we haven't constrained the ones inside. So we're going to Command Z that to go back to our previous state. And now we're going to look at these internally, and this is why I mentioned that I like to do those constraints of the individual elements early on, so we can avoid situations like these in the future and things are a little bit clearer as the design gets more complex. But as you can see, the center is no longer relevant, so I'm going to change the search box to be left and right with respect to its parent layer. I'm going to change the button also. Well, right now it's already centered as we wanted it. And this is on the left. I'm going to change this to center. So now, if I do this, ooh, there's still something that's going on. Oh yes, we haven't actually done the bits inside. So this one should be search center, and the microphone, you see here it's left top. We should actually put this right center. That should be everything we need, right? Yes. Okay, so as you can see, beyond this breakpoint, we are changing also the width of our search box as intended. And if we take a little bit of a zoom out, I'm gonna remove these from the side, gonna zoom to selection. You can see that we've got our 3 breakpoints with responsiveness thanks to Figma's auto layout and constraints. So that's it for today. We've covered layer structure, auto layout, and constraints to make the design that we had at hand responsive to different screen widths. If you are interested in seeing how we're going to be taking this design to the next level through more techniques and practices, make sure to stay tuned, hit subscribe for the upcoming videos. We have a lot more to cover to make this design pixel perfect and deliverable. Stay safe and see you next time.